Try to picture a very ordinary couple. Both of them work full-time, stable jobs. No one is unemployed, no one is doing gig work or scraping by. One works in marketing, the other in IT. Their income isn't extraordinary, but it's clearly above average. Put together, it's enough for people on the outside to look at them and think, they're doing fine, nothing to worry about here. They did everything society says you're supposed to do. Got a proper education, choose solid careers, got married, combined their finances, bought a home, tried to build a stable life. On paper, nothing went wrong. Every step makes sense. But if you ask them how it actually feels, the answer usually doesn't match the numbers on their paychecks. They're tired, they're stressed, they constantly feel like they have to keep up, like slowing down isn't an option. Money comes in regularly every month, but money goes out just as regularly. By the end of the month, their bank account is almost back where it started, paycheck to paycheck, or at least very close to it. There is an emergency fund technically, but it's so thin that a single unexpected event immediately puts it at risk. A surprise medical bill, a car repair, a short disruption in income. Even small things are enough to make their heart rate spike. What's strange is that they're not reckless spenders. They're not shopping impulsively. They're not living lavishly. They're just living at the same standard as everyone around them. And that's what makes the feeling so confusing. If you're doing everything right, if you have two incomes, the pressure should go down, shouldn't it? You should feel safer, not more fragile. If this sounds familiar, it might be because you're very close to this story. Maybe you've looked at your total income and wondered why it doesn't bring the sense of relief you expected. Why having two incomes doesn't make things feel easier. Why the harder you try, the more stuck you seem to feel. This is the core question of this video. And if you stay until the end, a lot of what you've been feeling but haven't been able to put into words will start to click into place. If you look at it simply, this belief almost doesn't seem debatable. Two incomes should obviously be safer than one. It's the most basic math there is. If one person can support a household, then two people should clearly be more comfortable. An extra paycheck should mean an extra cushion, more protection, more breathing room. At least that's the story we've heard repeated and accepted as obvious for decades. And maybe right now you're thinking, so where's the problem? If two incomes are still stressful, it must be spending or poor money management. That reaction is completely natural. When the math looks right but the outcome feels wrong, we tend to look for mistakes in the person doing the math. But what makes this situation far more uncomfortable is this: many two-income households aren't doing the math wrong at all. They're calculating perfectly reasonably, they're just using a formula that quietly changed without them realizing it. What actually happened isn't that two incomes stopped adding up. What happened is that the world around us adjusted once two incomes became the norm. As more households gained higher purchasing power, the definition of what's normal automatically shifted. Things that were once priced for one income started being priced for two. Housing, education, cost of living, all of it expanded to absorb the money we thought would create security. This is the moment to name the problem. This phenomenon is often called the two-income trap. You don't need to care who coined the term or the academic research behind it. What matters is one simple idea: two incomes no longer provide the extra safety we assume they do. In many cases, they actually make a household's financial system more fragile because life has been designed around the assumption that both incomes will always be there, uninterrupted, reliable, and perfectly aligned. And this part needs to be said very clearly. If you're feeling pressure despite having a decent income, it's not because you lack discipline or financial knowledge. You didn't do anything wrong. You're operating inside a structure designed to fully consume your earning capacity, not to create margin. This isn't a personal failure that can be fixed by trying harder. It's a systemic trap, and there's a good chance you're standing right in the middle of it.
Chào
To
mọi người,
truly
hôm nay tôi sẽ
understand
thuyết
why
trình
this
về một chủ
trap
đề rất thú
exists,
vị.
we need
Nó
to
liên quan
step
đến cách
back
chúng
for
ta
a
có thể
moment.
cải thiện cuộc sống hàng ngày một
Not
cách.
to compare who had it easier, but to see a very important difference in how life used to be designed. A few decades ago, the dominant family model was built around a single primary income. One person worked full-time, while the other stayed home or worked only when necessary. That may feel distant today, but the key point isn't about gender roles, it's about the cost structure built around that model. In that context, the cost of living was designed around one income. Housing was priced within reach of an average salary. Public schools were good enough that you didn't have to buy into an expensive neighborhood just to give your kids a decent education. Childcare wasn't a major expense because someone was usually home. Life wasn't luxurious, but it worked. And more importantly, it had a margin. It had slack. It could absorb error. This is the critical point. In that model, the second income wasn't required to keep the system running month to month. It existed as a backup plan, a card that hadn't been played yet. If the primary earner lost a job or if the family needed extra money, the other person could enter the workforce. The second income was insurance that hadn't been activated, not fuel for the car needed just to keep moving. That may sound strange to us today. And if you're thinking, how was that even possible? That question itself reveals how much things have changed. When fixed costs are low enough, life doesn't need to operate at full throttle just to stay in place. There's room to slow down. There are choices. There's an exit ramp. If adjustments are needed, they can be made without collapsing the entire system. Now compare that to today. Many households now need both incomes just to maintain a basic standard of living, not to get ahead just to avoid falling behind. The second income is no longer a backup. It has become a required component of the system, and when your backup card is already on the table from the start, there's nothing left to play when a real disruption hits. And if you feel like you have no real option except to keep pushing to keep both incomes going at all costs, there's a good chance you're living inside a structure where backup no longer exists. Not because you're less adaptable than previous generations, but because the life around you has been designed in a way that leaves no room for retreat. The problem isn't that two incomes appeared. The problem is that the moment they became the standard, as more households moved to having two sources of income, the entire system around them began adjusting to that new reality. No one sat down and agreed on this. It happened quietly through markets, through policy, through social expectations. But the consequences are unmistakable. Things that were once designed for one income started being priced for two. Housing is where this shift shows up first, and most clearly. As two incomes became common, collective purchasing power rose and home prices responded. Neighborhoods with good school safety and basic amenities began to be priced for dual-income households, not because people suddenly wanted luxury, but because that became the cost of accessing what was considered basic. Schools, neighborhoods, opportunities for children, all of it gradually became tied to expenses that only make sense if both adults are working. At the same time, other living costs rose alongside it. Childcare, healthcare, transportation. Everything was built on the assumption that both people in the household are earning income. This creates a dangerous reversal. What used to be a backup plan becomes required fuel. The second income is no longer there if needed. It becomes necessary for the system to function at all. This is the moment the trap truly forms. The emergency plan is now permanently activated. There is no longer a normal state where one income is enough to survive. Everything is running in emergency mode, but we call it normal. And when a system is always operating at maximum capacity, it cannot absorb shock. It only takes one small disruption for it to start shaking. If you feel like you can't slow down, can't ease off, can't even imagine taking a pause, that's not because you lack willpower. It's because the structure around you doesn't allow it. When fixed costs are built around two incomes, losing one isn't just a reduction in money, it collapses the entire design of life. And this is the core truth that needs to be stated clearly: the backup plan has become the default operating system. When that happens, two incomes no longer provide safety. They simply allow you to stand still inside an increasingly expensive system. And the chronic stress so many people live with isn't a sign of personal failure. It's a signal that you're locked into a structure with no exit ramp. By this point, a question has almost certainly formed in your mind. If two incomes don't create more security, if the pressure doesn't actually ease, then where did the second income go? Because in most people's imagination, that money is assigned a very specific role. It's the savings, the buffer, the part that's supposed to make life feel lighter over time. And yet, after a few years, many families arrive at a confusing realization: they don't feel like they have more money at all. What's important to understand is that the second income rarely disappears because of one big decision. It's not blown on luxury purchases or impulsive shopping sprees. It vanishes in a much more subtle way. It gets broken down layer by layer through expenses that each seem reasonable on their own. The first layer is taxes. A second income is often taxed at a higher marginal rate, so before the money even hits your account, its real value is already smaller than the number on paper. Then come the costs tied directly to both people working. If there are children, childcare is almost unavoidable. If there aren't, there are still commuting costs, travel time transportation, and often the need for an additional car. None of these expenses is shocking by itself, but they show up consistently quietly eating into that extra income. Then there's a layer that's talked about less but felt everywhere: the cost of exhaustion. When both people work full time, energy becomes scarce. Time to cook, clean, and maintain the household shrinks. To compensate, money gets spent on convenience, takeout, delivery, services. Not because you're careless, but because you're tired. And these expenses rarely register as big spending. They're simply how life keeps moving. If you pause and think carefully, you'll notice the most uncomfortable part of all this. There was never a moment when you sat down and decided, we're going to spend the entire second income. There's no single bill large enough to trigger alarm bells. Everything happens in a gray zone of reasonableness. Every expense has a justification. And because of that, there's no clear feeling of wrongdoing, only the persistent sense that money is always tight even when income isn't low. If this sounds familiar, it's because you didn't do anything wrong. The second income didn't disappear. It wasn't wasted in the usual sense. It was absorbed by a life structure that expanded to hold it. And once a structure becomes accustomed to a stream of money, removing that stream is no longer an adjustment, it's a shock. That feeling, the sense that you can't afford to lose the second income, is the clearest sign that the money was never truly yours in the first place. When the second income has been fully absorbed, the question is no longer where the money went. From that point on, the trap moves to a deeper level behavior. More specifically, how we make major life decisions. Because when you look at the combined income, the number looks convincing. It creates a sense of stability. It makes you believe you're in a much safer position than you actually are. With a large enough number on paper, decisions begin to expand accordingly. Housing is the clearest example. The bank looks at 2 paychecks and tells you that you can afford a bigger loan. The realtor says the price makes sense for the market. You look around and see similar families making the same choices. And so the decision gets made. Not because you want to take a risk, but because it feels perfectly reasonable when 2 incomes are flowing steadily. Then comes debt. Then lifestyle, cars, neighborhoods, and schools for your children. Every choice rests on the same unspoken assumption, one that rarely gets said out loud: both incomes will always be there. Not just this year or next, but continuously, reliably, without interruption. You don't sit down to test that assumption. You simply accept it as true because right now, everything seems to be working. At this point, you may be thinking, but we're different, we're careful, we have a plan. Almost every household in this situation thinks the same way, and that's exactly what makes this trap dangerous. Because the issue isn't whether you have a plan. The issue is that the plan is built on a foundation with zero margin for error. When the entire structure of life depends on both incomes never being disrupted, even a small change is enough to create serious pressure. What needs to be said clearly is this: you're not reckless. You're not undisciplined. You're not living beyond your means in the usual sense. The decisions you've made all make sense when viewed individually. But when you stack them together, a different picture emerges. You've designed your life around a fragile system, one that looks fine when everything goes according to plan, but has no capacity to absorb shock. And if you feel like you can't slow down, can't step back, can't even reconsider, not even in your thoughts, that's not a sign of excessive ambition. It's a sign that your major decisions have been anchored to a single assumption. When that assumption leaves no room for error, the pressure doesn't come from a lack of money. It comes from the fact that there's no exit left. When you put all the pieces together, what emerges isn't a single mistake, but a loop. A loop that's easy to step into and very hard to exit once you're inside. And what makes it dangerous is that at every step, everything feels reasonable. You don't see yourself falling into a trap. You just see yourself trying to do the right thing. The loop starts with 2 incomes. 2 streams of money create a sense of safety, a belief that you can handle more. From that feeling, fixed costs begin to rise. Not because you're ambitious, but because the standard around you has shifted. Housing, neighborhoods, schools, all are chosen based on what two paychecks seem to allow. Each decision looks sensible when viewed on its own. As fixed costs rise, the margin slowly disappears. The second income, which was once a buffer, now gets fully consumed just to maintain the current state. There's no money truly being set aside because the system has grown accustomed to absorbing the entire cash flow. And when the margin is gone, stress begins to build. Not explosive stress, but background pressure always present in everyday decisions. From there, the ability to slow down disappears. You can't easily ease off rest or change direction because fixed costs don't wait. Everything requires both incomes to keep flowing steadily. And when this goes on long enough, dependence becomes permanent. Two incomes stop being a choice. They become a condition for survival. The irony is that the harder you try, the tighter the loop gets. You work more to reduce pressure, but pressure increases because the system grows larger. You earn more to feel safer, but the sense of fragility doesn't go away. You run faster, but you stay in place. And because you don't see the entire loop, it's easy to believe that just a little more effort will finally make everything okay. Pause for a moment and ask yourself, which part of the loop are you in right now? The moment you start to recognize your position is often the first moment the trap becomes visible. And only when you can see the loop do you have a chance to step out of it. Once you've seen the two-income loop, there's one crucial thing that needs to be clarified to avoid the wrong conclusion. This is not a story about poor personal decisions. It's not because you lack discipline. It's not because you don't know how to manage money. And it's not because you want too much. Many of the choices you've made are entirely reasonable within the context you're living in. The problem is that the context itself has changed in ways most of us were never warned about. Start with housing. Home prices didn't rise because individual families suddenly decided to spend more. They rose because collective purchasing power increased once two incomes became the norm. When most buyers have two paychecks, the market's definition of what's normal automatically shifts. No conspiracy is required. No centralized decision needs to be made. When enough people can pay more for the same asset, prices respond. The same dynamic applies to schools and neighborhoods. Good schools tend to be tied to safe areas, strong amenities, and stable communities. And those areas are rarely cheap. As dual-income families compete with one another to access these things for their children, two incomes gradually become the price of admission. Not a ticket to luxury, but a ticket to what's considered basic: a stable environment, a decent school, a safe place to live. If this makes you uncomfortable, that reaction is completely normal because it touches on an unsettling reality. Many of the highest costs in modern life are no longer purely personal choices. They're the result of collective competition where each household is simply trying not to fall behind. And when everyone does that at the same time, the baseline rises, even though no one truly feels like they're winning. This is where guilt needs to be removed. When you look at your situation and think, "I must have messed something up," you're placing personal blame on a systemic problem. This system doesn't reward creating margin. It rewards using up your full capacity to pay. And when you follow those signals, you're not failing. You're just playing by the rules. The key takeaway to remember is this: when everyone has two incomes stop being an advantage. They become the minimum requirement just to stand still in an increasingly expensive life. Recognizing this doesn't make you pessimistic. It helps you stop blaming yourself and start asking the right question. If the problem is the system, is there a way to redesign life so you don't have to keep running inside the same loop? Once you clearly see that this is a systemic problem, the next question is no longer, how do I make more money, but how do I stop being trapped? And the answer isn't about turning back time or forcing one person to quit their job. It's about how you design the foundation of your life. There is one very simple principle, but one that runs directly against how most dual-income households operate today. The principle is this: your fixed costs should be survivable on one income, not living on one income, not giving up the second income, simply designing the foundation so that if one income disappears, life doesn't immediately collapse. This may sound extreme, but in reality, it's just a shift in defaults. Instead of designing life around the combined total of two paychecks, you design it around one and treat the other as a bonus. If your first reaction is that this isn't realistic, you're not alone. Most people's instinctive response is, "We can't do that." But what's important to understand is that this principle doesn't require you to change everything overnight. It doesn't require anyone to quit their job. It simply requires you to stop assuming that both incomes will always be there and to stop adding fixed costs based on that assumption. When you apply this principle, something crucial changes. The second income switches roles. It stops being mandatory fuel for the system and becomes optionality, a choice. It can be used to build emergency reserves, invest for the long term, pay down debt faster, or buy back flexibility for the future. Most importantly, it no longer gets absorbed the moment it arrives. It's preserved as a buffer rather than consumed to sustain the present. Of course, this requires short-term trade-offs. It may mean choosing a smaller home than the maximum loan you're approved for. It may mean delaying lifestyle upgrades even when you technically can afford them. These choices are rarely rewarded by society, but their purpose isn't austerity. Their purpose is to buy back margin. When you build a foundation that can stand on one income, you don't just reduce risk, you regain choice. And in a world where so many people are locked into maintaining two incomes at all costs, having choice is one of the rarest and most durable forms of financial security. Two incomes by themselves are not a bad thing. An additional stream of money can bring real benefits if it actually creates space and choice. The problem begins when both incomes are already spent in advance, locked into fixed costs, to the point where they no longer create a sense of safety and only maintain the current state. At that point, two incomes stop being a leverage. They put pressure. Many people think financial security is a numbers game. Earn more, be safer. But what we've just walked through shows the opposite. Security doesn't come from how much you earn. It comes from how much change you can absorb. It comes from margin, from the ability to slow down, from not being forced into panic the moment something goes wrong. That's why in the end, the story of the two-income trap isn't really about having more or less money. It's about flexibility, about whether you have an exit or not. Two incomes aren't better than one if you've lost your way out. If both are required just to keep everything from collapsing, the number on your paycheck says very little about how safe you actually are. Before we close, take a moment to ask yourself one simple but not easy question. Which parts of your life today depend entirely on both incomes? Housing, lifestyle, debt. When you begin to see those answers clearly, you've already taken a major step towards stepping out of the trap. If what you've just heard has made you look at money and your own decisions a little differently, then this channel is doing exactly what it's meant to do. Subscribe and stay with me for the next videos.